Rain pounded against the school windows, as if the sky itself mourned something it couldn't explain. In the empty hallway, teacher Elena packed her things into a cardboard box while muffled laughter echoed from the principal's office. Outside, her old car waited under the storm, but no one knew that tonight the road would roar for her. Stay till the end, because this story proves brotherhood is louder than injustice.
For over 15 years, Elena had been more than just a teacher. She had been the steady heartbeat of that small-town school, the kind of woman who believed that even the most wounded child could bloom if someone simply looked at them with faith instead of pity. Her classroom was a refuge built from patience and second chances. Walls covered in crayon drawings, quotes about courage, and sunlight filtering through curtains she had sewn herself. Each morning, before the first bus arrived, she would walk between the rows of desks, placing a gentle hand on each one, as if blessing the small battles that would be fought there that day. She believed in effort over perfection, in kindness over punishment, in the fragile magic of believing someone still cared. But small towns have long memories and short tempers, and sometimes goodness alone cannot stand against power wrapped in ego. It started with a single complaint, a student caught cheating, a grade questioned, a parent too proud to accept fault. That parent wasn't just anyone. He owned the hardware store, sat on the school board, and believed money could rewrite truth. By the end of that week, whispers crawled through the hallways like smoke. Stories warped and retold until they no longer resembled reality. They said Elena had been unfair, that she'd humiliated a student, that she'd lost control. None of it was true. But in a place that small, lies travel faster than light. The letter came on a Friday morning, folded neatly, smelling of cold ink and finality. The principal didn't even look her in the eyes. He read the words like a man already halfway out the door, while Elena stood still, her world shrinking with every sentence. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like 1,000 small accusations. When he finished, he offered a forced apology, and then came the part that hurt most, the escort. 2 teachers, colleagues she had mentored, stood by her side, silent and ashamed, as if proximity to her might stain them. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply picked up the box that had once held her students' drawings and walked down the hallway she had spent her life filling with hope.
Each step echoed through the corridor like the end of a song. The children had already gone home, but she could still see their faces. The boy who stuttered when he read aloud, the girl who believed she was invisible until Elena said her name out loud. All of them memories now trapped behind glass doors and gossip. She drove away slowly, through streets that no longer felt like home, past the bakery where she used to buy muffins for her class, past the church whose bells marked the rhythm of her years. The rain grew heavier, blurring the world into streaks of gray, and soon the town was nothing but reflection and regret in her rear-view mirror. The road stretched on, lonely and wet, winding into open desert where the wind carried the smell of dust and gasoline. And then she saw them, a faint red glow through the curtain of rain, a line of motorcycles, engines humming low, parked beneath the flickering sign of a forgotten gas station. The men stood beneath the canopy, jackets darkened by water and time, faces carved by miles of road. They didn't speak, and they didn't need to. Their silence was heavier than thunder. As Elena passed by, one of them lifted his chin slightly, a gesture not of intrusion, but of quiet recognition, as if he could see the weight she carried. She slowed the car without knowing why. Maybe it was the rhythm of their engines, steady and grounded, that pulled her back from the edge of despair. Maybe it was the look in their eyes, men who had seen loss, betrayal, and the strange mercy that sometimes grows from pain. For a moment, the rain eased, and she sat there watching them through the windshield, unaware that the road had already begun to turn in her favor. She didn't know it yet, but fate has a way of weaving redemption through the most unlikely places. And that night, beneath the weeping sky of a nameless desert town, a teacher's broken story was about to find its echo in the roar of engines.
The bell above the door chimed softly as Elena stepped into the dim light of the gas station store, the sound swallowed by the hum of a dying neon sign outside. The air smelled of burnt coffee and rain-soaked asphalt. She rubbed her arms, still trembling from the drive, and stood there for a moment, a woman suspended between breaking down and holding on. The clerk barely looked up, lost in the rhythm of counting coins. And somewhere in the back, the steady growl of engines idled like patient beasts waiting to move. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the cheap kind that tastes like metal and midnight, and sat at a corner table near the window. Outside, the storm played its song against the glass, relentless, unkind. The bikers stood beneath the canopy, their silhouettes framed by lightning. They weren't talking, not really, just standing there, watching the road as if it had secrets to tell. One of them, tall, bearded, with eyes the color of cold iron, turned his head slightly and caught her reflection in the glass. He noticed the faint tremor in her hand, the way she wiped her eyes when she thought no one was looking, and the small cardboard box visible through her car window, the kind of box people carry when they've just lost something important. He stepped inside, the doorbell ringing again, softer this time under the sound of rain. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he approached the counter, ordered a black coffee, and stood beside her without a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy,
like two storms meeting without thunder. After a while, he spoke, his voice deep and coarse, worn by wind and miles. "Rough day." Elena let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. She said, "Just another one," though both of them knew that wasn't true. The man nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the steam rising between them. He didn't ask questions. Bikers rarely do. They recognize pain the way soldiers recognize battle scars. It doesn't need to be explained.
He looked over his shoulder, meeting the eyes of the others outside. A single glance was enough. No words, no gestures, just that unspoken understanding that passes through men who have lived by their own code for too long. And in that instant, the low rumble of the motorcycles outside grew deeper, like thunder responding to injustice. It wasn't loud, it was restrained, deliberate, the kind of sound that feels like a promise waiting to be kept. Elena didn't know what that moment meant. She only knew that something in the air had shifted, that strange electric stillness that happens when fate begins to stir. She looked up, and the biker gave her a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that somehow said, "You're not invisible." Then he turned and walked back into the rain, his boots leaving wet footprints that would vanish in seconds, but somehow feel eternal. That night, the road carried their engines toward the horizon, red taillights fading into the storm. They didn't know her name, where she came from, or what had broken her spirit. But they knew the look of unfairness, the scent of humiliation, the quiet ache of someone who had been wronged by the world. And for men like them, that was reason enough. Because on the road, justice doesn't need introductions, only purpose. And theirs had just found her.
Morning came heavy with fog, the kind that swallows sound and turns the world into something half forgotten. The school stood silent, a gray shape against the pale horizon, its windows still fogged from the night rain. Teachers were inside, preparing their lessons, unaware that before the first bell could ring, the low, distant thunder of engines began to roll across the valley. Not sudden, but steady, like an approaching storm that had chosen its purpose long before dawn. One by one, the motorcycles appeared at the edge of town, their headlights cutting through the mist like lines of fire on wet asphalt. The rumble grew louder, deeper, until the vibration seemed to move through the ground itself, shaking windows, hearts, and memories. People stepped out of diners, shopkeepers froze mid-conversation, and even the morning birds fell silent, as if nature itself had recognized something sacred in their arrival. Dozens of riders, faces half hidden behind tinted visors and weathered leather, rode in tight formation. Not a gang, but a brotherhood forged in roads, loss, and loyalty. They didn't need banners or words. The sound of their engines was language enough. When they reached the school, they did not rush or roar. They circled the parking lot with precision, engines humming in perfect unison.
forming a wall of chrome and thunder that seemed less like intimidation and more like protection, a barrier between truth and hypocrisy. Teachers pressed their faces to the glass, whispering to one another in disbelief. Students gathered near the windows, drawn by curiosity and awe, their young minds sensing instinctively that something important was unfolding, something that would be remembered long after textbooks and timetables had been forgotten. Elena stood frozen on the steps, her heart pounding in her chest as she recognized the silhouettes from the night before. For a moment, time seemed to dissolve, and all she could hear was the pulse of engines syncing with the rhythm of her breath. The leader dismounted slowly, his boots landing on the wet pavement with the sound of finality.
He took off his helmet, revealing a face marked by years of wind and consequence. A man who had lived by a code older than laws and simpler than justice. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. In his calmness, in the weight of his silence, there was recognition, an unspoken promise kept. He walked toward the school doors, each step echoing across the courtyard like a verdict. The principal waited just beyond the glass, pale and rigid, clutching his clipboard as if it could protect him from truth. When the biker entered, he didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't need to explain who he was or why he was there. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a large envelope, and laid it carefully on the principal's desk, a single motion that carried more power than any threat could. Inside were statements, handwritten, signed by the townsfolk, parents, store owners, students, even teachers who had found their courage overnight. Each page was a piece of truth, a quiet rebellion against the lie that had tried to erase a good woman's name. The principal's eyes flicked across the papers, his lips parting slightly, but no words came. The air felt thick, electric, not with violence, but with justice waiting to breathe. The biker said nothing. He simply stepped back, nodded once, and turned to leave, the leather of his jacket creaking softly in the silence. Behind him, the other riders stood motionless, their reflections caught in the glass, a wall of silent witnesses that made excuses feel small. When he reached the door, he paused and looked back, his voice deep, low, and steady, a voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to show up. Then he walked out into the light, and the engines answered him, a chorus of thunder that rolled across the schoolyard like a closing statement written by the road itself. If you still believe loyalty means something, subscribe to Hell's Road, because stories like this are far from over.
The air outside the school felt heavier than it should have, as if even the clouds had stopped to watch what would happen next. The riders stood still, their engines idling low, not roaring, not revving, just breathing, steady and alive, like the heartbeats of men who had seen too much to act in haste.
The smoke from their exhaust rose into the cold morning air, curling upward in thin gray ribbons that seemed to stitch the sky back together after years of silence and fear. No one moved, no one spoke. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough. The kind of quiet power that doesn't come from numbers or noise, but from conviction. Teachers peered from the windows, students pressed against the glass, and for the first time in a long while, the schoolyard didn't feel like a place of shame or gossip. It felt like sacred ground, guarded by something older than rules. The bikers waited, patient and unflinching, their figures framed by sunlight breaking weakly through the mist. Their leather jackets glistened with rain and time, the patches on their backs worn thin by miles, their colors faded but never surrendered. Each mark told a story of lost brothers, forgiven debts, roads taken and left behind, a living tapestry of loyalty, stitched not with thread, but with truth. They didn't need to shout their message. It was carved into the way they stood, into the slow rhythm of engines refusing to die down, into the silence that said, "We are not here for vengeance, we are here for honor." Their emblem, a winged skull surrounded by flame, wasn't meant to frighten anyone. It was a reminder, a symbol that real brotherhood is born from scars, and that those who live by the code never ride alone.
The leader stood at the edge of the line, gloved hands resting on his handlebars, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the school building, into the horizon that had raised him, broken him, and taught him what loyalty really costs. He didn't need to look back to know his brothers were behind him. He could feel it, the invisible bond that years of wind and asphalt had woven tighter than blood. And then, in that moment between waiting and resolution, the narrator's voice rose, not as an interruption, but as an echo of their creed. "You can carry that same spirit," he said, the words heavy, resonant, almost sacred. "Our official Hell's Road gear is linked below, not just for riders, but for anyone who still believes in loyalty, in truth, and in standing tall when the world looks away. It's not merchandise, it's a mark of belonging for those who live by the code." The engines kept running, low and constant, their vibrations rolling through the pavement like a heartbeat shared by everyone who dared to still believe. And as the first gust of wind swept across the lot, stirring dust and sunlight into motion, the horizon seemed to whisper what everyone already felt deep inside: that something had changed, that a storm of justice had already begun to move, and that from that day forward, the world would remember what it sounds like when honor refuses to stay silent.
Inside the principal's office, the air felt thick. The kind of air that knows it's about to witness something irreversible. The man sat behind his desk, his hands trembling just enough to betray the calm he tried to wear. The envelope lay open before him, its contents spread like silent witnesses across the polished wood. signatures, testimonies, truths written in plain ink that no longer feared being whispered. He searched for words, for excuses, for the hollow comfort of authority, but each attempt died in his throat, strangled by the weight of guilt pressing against the walls. Elena stood in the doorway, not as a victim, not as the broken woman who had driven away in the rain, but as someone who had walked through humiliation and come out the other side with her head unbowed. The silence between them was immense, a silence built from weeks of gossip, lies, and sleepless nights. And yet within it there was a strange peace, as if the universe itself had paused to let justice finally take a breath. The principal stammered, his voice thin, brittle. He spoke of misunderstandings, of procedures, of how these things happen. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted toward the window where the reflection of dozens of motorcycles waited, a silent jury that needed no translation. The engines outside murmured low and steady, their rhythm echoing like a second heartbeat within the walls, reminding everyone present that truth had arrived, and it didn't come alone.
Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was heavier than anger, her presence sharper than any accusation. When she finally spoke, her words carried the clarity of dawn cutting through fog. "I never asked for pity," she said softly, "only for what's right." And in that single line, every rumor, every doubt, every betrayal that had buried her name began to crumble like dust under the weight of something far stronger: dignity. Outside, the bikers remained still, lined up in quiet formation. The parents began to arrive, one by one. Men and women who had once stayed silent, now walking side by side, their faces pale but determined. They entered the office carrying a new document, a reinstatement form signed by the entire town. Every witness, every neighbor who had finally decided that silence was no longer loyalty, but cowardice. When Elena stepped outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time that morning, scattering across chrome and leather like fire on water. The riders turned their heads toward her, the leader giving a small, solemn nod, an acknowledgement that the mission was complete, that justice, in its quiet and undeniable way, had been restored. Then, one by one, the engines came alive. A deep, thunderous growl that rolled across the schoolyard and up into the hills. The sound wasn't loud in anger, but strong in reverence. A hymn of loyalty echoing across the asphalt. As the bikes pulled away, their tires slicing through puddles left by the night storm, the town stood still, watching. Children pressed their hands against the windows, wide-eyed, as the last echoes faded into the distance. And in that silence, the world seemed to whisper a truth older than law itself, that sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge or a robe. Sometimes it rides on two wheels and answers only to the road.
That afternoon, the storm had already passed.
leaving behind a sky washed clean by light and silence. The schoolyard, still damp from the rain, shimmered beneath the hesitant sun, as if the world itself had been rinsed of its lies. Inside the classroom, Elena stood by the blackboard once again, the same room from which she had been exiled, now bathed in the golden hush of late day. Dust danced through the air like forgotten dreams, floating lazily in the beam of sunlight that fell across the desks. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the weight of the past weeks melt into the floorboards, into the chalk dust, into the sound of children breathing softly behind her. Then, with slow precision, she picked up a piece of white chalk, its tip trembling slightly between her fingers, and began to write on the board, not as a lesson, not as a command, but as a reminder, carved in quiet defiance. Truth always finds its way back. Each letter curved with calm authority, each word a scar healed by conviction. When she stepped back and looked at the sentence, something inside her, something that had been locked away by humiliation and pain, finally exhaled. She turned to face her students, who watched her in silence, their small faces illuminated by the light filtering through the blinds. They didn't understand everything that had happened, but they understood enough that courage had returned, and that justice, though slow, had a sound all its own. Somewhere beyond those walls, a faint vibration drifted through the stillness, the distant murmur of engines rolling far down the highway, fading into memory, but never truly gone. Elena paused, her gaze unfocused for a heartbeat, a small smile crossing her face as the echo reached her chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't need to look outside to know who it was. Some debts are paid not with words, but with presence, and some promises don't need to be spoken twice. The students began to laugh again, real laughter, the kind that rebuilds broken spaces. And as their voices rose, filling the room with life, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Not the kind given by a paycheck or a title, but the kind that comes when the world finally sees you for who you are. Some roads lead to redemption, others to memory. If you want to keep the fire alive, the official Hell's Road store is linked below, where brotherhood lives beyond the story. Outside, the sun slid lower across the horizon, painting the road in gold. And though the engines had long disappeared, their spirit lingered in the air, a low hum of defiance, a quiet promise that on this road no one truly rides alone.
Days drifted by, slow and weightless, the kind of days that feel like echoes after a storm. The town returned to its rhythm, morning bells, the rustle of papers, the hum of everyday life. But beneath it all, something subtle had changed, as if a hidden balance had quietly been restored.
The school once again filled with the sound of laughter and learning. Yet every so often, that ordinary calm was broken by a familiar tremor, the distant roar of engines rolling down the highway beyond the hills. Each time it happened, the children would pause mid-sentence, their eyes lighting up as they rushed toward the windows, pressing small hands against the glass. They didn't say much. They didn't have to, because that sound, that thunder of steel and road, carried something sacred for them now. It wasn't fear. It wasn't noise. It was memory. A reminder that good people still stand up for one another, that truth can ride through rain and rumor and still find its way home. Elena would look up from her desk each time the rumble reached the schoolyard, and a faint smile would find her lips, soft and knowing. She didn't expect them to return. She didn't need to, because she understood now that justice doesn't always arrive wearing a uniform, holding a book of laws, or demanding to be seen. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried by the sound of engines and the scent of rain on the road. Sometimes it wears leather, weathered, torn, and real, and it rides away before anyone can even say thank you. Outside, the sound would fade slowly into the horizon, leaving behind a silence that felt almost alive. And in that silence, Elena would close her eyes for a moment, letting the memory of that day settle deep within her, not as a wound, but as a promise that somewhere out there, beyond the edges of the town, there are still men who believe in honor, and roads that remember the names of those who stood for what was right. The chalk dust swirled softly in the late afternoon light. The laughter of children filled the air once more, and for the first time in a long while, the world, small as it was, felt just. This was one of many forgotten legends of the road. Subscribe to Hell's Road and ride with us into the next story.